Well, Steve Gleason has inspired countless people living with health challenges and their families. His story is about overcoming obstacles despite one's physical weaknesses. Paul Murphy reports on Gleason's impact on ALS patients and researchers hoping to one day find a cure.
Jay Quinlan has hope, thanks to Steve Gleason. Hope that his life won't be limited to the 2 to 5 years doctors expect for an ALS patient.
Steve shows those of us diagnosed that that's not necessarily the case.
The former high-profile prosecutor with the U.S. Attorney's Office in New Orleans was diagnosed with ALS in August 2016. Gleason's had the disease since 2011.
I don't know where we'd be without the Gleason Foundation. I really don't.
Quinlan's wife Stephanie says one of the first calls they made after the ALS diagnosis was to Team Gleason. Since then, Gleason and his foundation have provided information, support, and technical assistance to the Quinlan family.
Go Tigers!
Despite his limitations, Jay Quinlan was able to watch LSU win the national championship in the Dome Monday night.
I cannot imagine the number of ALS patients and their families who would have just been adrift without the guidance of Steve Gleason and his team.
Gleason is also an inspiration to Dr. Nicholas Bazan, director of the Neuroscience Center at LSU Health New Orleans. He and his team of researchers met Gleason. Bazan called him an important human being with a brain disease they hope to one day cure.
To me, it has been remarkable when I have met with him, was in spite of his decay, to see how positive he was and how interested he was on what we were doing. And it's really remarkable.
Families dealing with ALS feed on Steve Gleason's positive attitude.
We're going to beat all the odds and prove all the doctors wrong.
No white flags. Paul Murphy, Eyewitness News.
And Americans who've lost their voices due to degenerative diseases now have expanded access to voice-generating devices through Medicare and Medicaid under a law that was inspired by Steve Gleason.
And like other recipients, Gleason was able to design the look of his Congressional Gold Medal. The front shows him wearing his Saints jersey, raising his fist in the air, and the back shows the mountains of his native state of Washington with the words, "Keep exploring." The medal was initially given to soldiers, but it has honored a wide variety of people. George Washington received the first one. Thomas Edison and Winston Churchill also received them. So have Walt Disney, Bob Hope, and John Wayne. Now, Gleason initially responded to the announcement very humbly, stating, "Talk about feeling undeserving. The list of past winners is filled with enlightened and powerful giants of humanity. It's ridiculously overwhelming." Along with the Presidential Medal of Freedom, the Congressional Gold Medal is the highest civilian award in the United States. Gleason is the first NFL player to receive one. They're also awarded for things that happened in the past. Some of the most recent medals were awarded to the women at NASA, whose stories were told in the film Hidden Figures. We'll have more from Gleason's ceremony coming up tonight on the Eyewitness News at 10.